In this video, I'm going to take you through these 3 digital painting studies of photos that I took on my phone. I'll be using my own free cloud brush pack, which you can download on my Gumroad store. Look for this cover image. They work in Procreate, Photoshop CC, or Clip Studio Paint. You can type in 0 in the payment field to download them for free or tip any amount you want. I'm going to be doing commentary live and unscripted for this video. I want to just take you through some of my thought processes as I'm doing studies like these. I put this one first because it's going to be real time. It was only a 15-minute study. The other 2 were a little bit longer, so I sped them up so that the video wouldn't be too long because I don't think I had an hour worth of things to say about this. But this first one being real time, I think it'll be easier for you to see what I'm doing and for me to talk about some of the choices that I'm making so that then you can recognize those same techniques and choices in the other studies when things are moving a little bit faster. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is how in studies like these, I am not always trying to color match exactly or to put things exactly in the position they're in the photo. I'm really kind of trying to make my own version of it. Sometimes I'm trying to color match exactly, and in the next demo, actually, I am trying to color match a lot more accurately than in this one because the colors are so specific to the sort of sunset that I'll be painting in the next one. But without getting too ahead of myself, in this one, it's a pretty simple color scheme. It's just blue and white and gray. So I decided to stray a little bit from the colors that I could see directly in the photo and bring a little bit more warmth into the whites and a little bit more richness into the blues, just because that's a color scheme that I personally like. And I also changed the position of the clouds a good amount in this study. I actually love the way that the cloud looks in the photo, so I tried to give it a little bit more energy to just kind of use it as a jumping off point to do my own version around. So one of the changes that I can see in retrospect that I made, which I think suits my own sensibility, is I made some of the lines a little bit more diagonal. Like you can see that in the photo, the top of the cloud is a little bit flatter, and I made it just a little bit more diagonal and a little bit more energetic in my own version. And then I made that line going in, that cut in, even more dramatic too. It kind of comes to more of a point. I think I just found this a more interesting shape. I'm not really making conscious decisions while I'm working on a study like this so much as just kind of making a decision about whether I like what I've done or not, and then I'll undo the brush stroke if I don't like what I've done, or I'll paint over it. To start getting into the more practical side of things, less theoretical and style oriented, I usually start out my cloud studies by using very cloud looking brushes. So in the brush pack, if you're using my brush pack, I'm using different clouds from the fluffy cloud section, the ones that are really based around real cloud textures, not so much the watercolor ones or the painting ones. I bring those in later on, but I like to start out with very real looking cloud textures so that then later when I go to paint on top, I can kind of make artistic choices about where I want the painting to look more painterly and more painted. I can make strategic choices about where to put brush strokes, what areas I should have visible brush strokes in, or like visible rake brushes or something that makes it look a little bit more viz dev, animation industry, which is always kind of what I'm adjacent to because that's where I got my start. I like to make those choices later on once I have a more complete vision of the whole painting, but I like to give myself kind of a clean slate of more naturalistic textures first so that then I can build on it later. So I'm starting by trying to mimic the textures that I'm seeing in the photo as much as I can. So I'm trying to pick brushes that are creating the textures that I see in the photo. And when I was making the brush set, I had this sort of thing in mind, this sort of process in mind. I really wanted to build a brush set that I could use in this way, which is why there's so many different texture brushes and why you'll see me opening up the brush window frequently throughout the study process and picking out different brushes that represent different sort of cloud textures to paint different parts of the images with. As I'm watching this back, I'm actually a little bit surprised at how slow and deliberate my mark making becomes sometimes. When I'm painting a study like this, I think I get really in the zone, and I don't notice time going by, so it feels like it all happens very quickly. But I actually am making some pretty careful choices about what marks I'm putting down, and you'll see me put paint down and then undo it all the time. That I know I'm doing, but I think in my head it feels like it's moving faster than it's happening in real life. I am making calculated choices every time I'm putting a mark down. So like in this section here, I really want it to look three-dimensional. There's light shining through these sections of cloud that are sticking up out of the shadow zone, and those little puffs are then kind of melting away into the shadow mass, and I really wanted to represent that with as much integrity as I could. So I chose some more textured, wispier cloud brushes to use to build in those light areas, and then I picked some softer brushes to use to erase out, the parts of the cloud wisps that are disappearing into the shadow. And then I'm going in over top with some even more fine detailed textured wispy clouds to add in that feeling of those little wisps that are being blown by the wind away from the larger wisps of cloud. I think those little tiny details, they do a lot of heavy lifting in getting a cloud painting to look realistic, and spending a little bit of extra time getting areas like that, those wispy puffs that disappear into the shadows and all those little extra bits of wisp that are kind of blowing off of them, getting areas like that to look right goes such a long way in a study like this. You don't need to get every part of the painting right. You really don't need to get the whole study right. You've probably heard me talk about this before if you've seen any of my other videos, but the human brain fills in a lot of information. So when I'm doing a study like this, I'm really trying to pick some key areas to focus on getting those areas, exactly right, exactly the way that I want them. And those areas will do heavy lifting in implying that the rest of the piece has that level of specificity and care and detail and three-dimensionality. As long as I'm getting some of that in there in key areas, that's usually enough to carry the study, especially a quicker study like this where it's only 15 minutes. The next thing I'm focusing on here is getting those puffs of white to feel a little bit rounder and a little bit thicker. The edges of the cloud are just feeling a little bit too wispy. There are a lot of wisps on this cloud, but you can also tell that it has substance. It has some areas that are pretty thick and opaque. So I'm just refining that edge and giving it a little bit of a harder edge, which will make it feel a little bit more substantial. One of the reasons that I think a lot of people find clouds challenging, and it's a really legitimate reason, is that a lot of the color combinations and the texture combinations that make clouds look realistic can also look really ugly if they're not executed, in the right way. And I run into this all the time. I feel like a lot of my cloud paintings, they almost have to go through kind of an ugly stage. This one, not quite so much because it's a much easier color combination. But when we get into the sunsets where you're putting grays and yellows right next to each other, it's so what makes it look good is so specific that it can be really challenging, I think, to newcomers, because you sometimes have to do quite a number of clouds before they start coming out in a way that you find personally appealing. And especially it can be really hard to make things that are kind of mushy and soft look dimensional and look structured. And I think that makes all of that together makes clouds a really challenging subject. They have often really challenging color combinations, really challenging edge combinations, like getting the right combination of hard edges and soft edges can be challenging. But all that to say, I think it's one of those things where when you do enough of them, it really does just start clicking, because you start picking up on what the specific little things you need to do that will make it look good, that will make it get over that, ugly bridge to looking good and looking pretty. But I'm going to try to point out some of those things as I go along here. I think that when I get to the stage where I'm painting on top of the naturalistic brushes that I've laid down, that's when I'm making a lot of those artistic choices that I think help bring the paintings together in a real way. Sometimes my cloud paintings, I feel like they look, a little bit not right until I get to the stage where I'm painting over top. But I have to just trust the process that I will be able to bring it all together when I do get to that stage. And I think that, earlier on in the art journey, it can be harder to trust the process. And sometimes it's still very hard for me to trust the process. I have ditched so many cloud studies over the course of my career, and I will ditch nameless or countless more over the next however many years, surely, because I just don't have it in me to push through and figure out what's wrong with it to keep going. I had a string of luck today working on these three. This is actually the final one that I worked on. It was the third one that I worked on, but I thought that it was maybe the easiest starting place, so that's why I started here. And I'm at that painting stage now where I'm using painterly brushes to just bring like an artist's touch back into the painting. This is where I add a lot of my harder edges. Cloud paintings benefit so much from having a couple like really hard edges and then some really, really soft edges as well. Usually it's that combination of the two that gets it to feel real and appealing. So when I go in with these paint brushes, this is where I'm really trying to add some artistic flair, some more motion, and to make it look like a more comprehensive, cohesive painting. You can see that when I was adding in those distant clouds in the back, and I'm kind of going over them here, I changed those quite a bit from the photo. I gave them a lot more energy. I gave them more of a slant. I'm trying to keep them in a more consistent motion that kind of interacts with the other clouds that I've created and creates some feeling of cohesive motion throughout the whole painting. And then I really, really feel like having some visible brush strokes brings a lot to at least my own paintings of clouds. There's something that, to me, getting some of those in there, it immediately makes the whole thing look more appealing. And this might just be a personal taste thing, but I always really love getting to this stage where I get to make some decisions about where I want to have visible brush strokes and visible harder edges that have been designed by a brush stroke. This is the stage where I feel like everything kind of falls into place for me. But I mean, it took a lot of building blocks to get there. I also wanted to shout out that I think one of the things color-wise that is hard about even daytime clouds like this is that there often needs to be a pretty careful balance of these desaturated grays and then these kind of cool blue grays, and sometimes they need to be right next to each other in a way that you often don't see. Sometimes just putting gray next to any sort of saturated color can feel really risky and strange, and until everything is in the right place can look pretty odd. But then I think it all does kind of come together in the end when you have the whole context of the whole color scheme, when you can read those grays as light coming through, that sort of thing. And then one other final good thing to mention is that you can sometimes see me go in at the very end and paint some smaller clouds with the brushes. I think just adding those little specular fine details also really helps bring the whole thing together and give it that appearance of having that level of painting detail in the whole piece. And of course, you don't need to use just the painterly brushes that I included in the cloud brush pack. There's so many amazing painterly brushes available for download. I just wanted to make sure I included some of the kind of textures that I really like in my cloud paintings so that you guys had access to those same sort of textures in your own paintings. All right, we're on to the next one. This one is sped up. I sped it up to 250% because it was a longer study. These are more challenging colors, and it took me more brain power to figure out how to make this one look decent. So I did speed this one up so that I wouldn't need to come up with a half hour of things to say about it, but I definitely have 15 minutes of things to say about it. So you'll see I'm starting here very similarly to the way that I started the last one, where I start by trying to mimic as much as possible the naturalistic cloud textures that I see in the photo. This painting I had a little bit smaller on my screen to start out with. I'm sorry about that. I naturally like painting a little bit smaller on the screen, but when I'm doing these demos for people to learn from, I am trying to make them larger so that they're easier to see. I will fix that in a little bit. But you can see that I'm picking out different brushes from the brush pack, moving from brush to brush, trying to capture a whole bunch of different textures that I see in this photo. You know, there's some clouds that are really foggy and wispy and windblown, and the edges are super, super soft. And then there's other areas where the edges are really hard and it's very solid looking. There's a really great combination of all different types of cloud textures in this one photo, which is part of what made me choose it. And then the other thing that made me choose it is that brilliant glow that, of course, will be a bit challenging to execute. But the way that I'm going to go about it here, and the way that tends to work out for me quite well in studies like this, is to create sort of a glow from within effect by actually having the inner layer, the bottom layer, being that bright glowy color. So I painted the whole thing out to be that glowy color first, and then I go in on top with the more desaturated color, and kind of lay that on top so that when you see what you see within the gaps between the brushes, between the textured brushes, is that glow coming through. So it feels then like it has that glow from within feeling, because it really is glowing from within. It's actually sort of a traditional painting method. A lot of traditional painters will use an undercoat, an underlayer of paint that will often have a much brighter color. So some painters, especially painters who are painting the natural world, plein air, will start with a really vibrant undercoat of paint, and then we'll paint on top of it with the more neutral colors, but with that vibrant color peeking from within, vibrant orange, vibrant yellow, vibrant red. It really feels like the whole painting is glowing from the inside. So that is the technique that I usually use in a painting like this. And then once I've finished one layer of clouds, you can see I've actually created another layer underneath, and I will paint directly underneath as well to create some of those glowing edges. Because what is going to make this cloud painting look dimensional and look more real is for it to really feel like the edges, the planes that are facing the sun are catching light, and then that other planes, which are turning away from the sun, are deeply in shadow. That's going to give it substance, give it form. So I try to use the Photoshop or whatever program layer structure to the best of my ability to create that sort of structured layered look with layers of different colors. And it's worth mentioning for sure that this is a pretty challenging combination of colors. And if you're following along with this study alongside me, then you're probably feeling the same way. And that's something I really love about painting clouds, actually, is that they often ask of us to become more comfortable with combinations of colors that are found in nature, but that are maybe not ones that we would typically choose ourselves. Clouds, in order to capture all of the beauty, we need to use some of these neutrals next to really vibrant colors in ways that sometimes feels a little uncomfortable. And the way that we capture that really bright glow is by pairing it with the neutrals, because something in a painting won't look like it's glowing vibrantly if we don't have a comparison point. If we don't have something darker and more desaturated to contrast against the glow to make that glow really shine. To go back into the paint application a little bit, I'm really trying to use brush strokes to kind of point into the middle bottom section of the painting. And you can see the clouds are kind of doing that on their own, just due to perspective and the warp of the kind of fisheye-ish lens that's in the photo. That effect gives the painting a lot of energy, and I'm pulling some of the streakier cloud brushes out of the wispy cloud section, some of the cloud streak brushes, to create that sort of motion and pull with those cloud lines to make them feel like they're pointing and, sending energy through the piece in different directions. Then I'm going in with some brushes that help me break up some of my edges. And I noticed that a lot of my oranges were a little bit too deep, and I didn't have enough of the lighter pastel peachier orange in there. So, trying to make sure that I don't go too solidly hot anywhere, that I can break it up with some of those more neutral highlights, that the combination together will create that sort of naturalistic glow that we expect from clouds. I also realized at this point that I was missing that kind of darkest shadow on the clouds, especially at the bottom. And the way that shadow settles over the clouds is very soft and kind of scattered. So I pulled some of the more scattered cloud texture brushes to lay those darker shadows on top to give it that feeling of really like different layers of color. You can see some little dark wisps of clouds on the bottom right. And just like the way that those light wisps of clouds really helped bring realism to the piece in the last study, I think those dark wisps really do a lot to add realism to this study. It's something that, we don't always think about, those cloud wisps being darker, being in the shadow, sitting darker in front of areas that are lit by sun. But that can happen, and adding those in sometimes adds a lot of depth and dimension and realism. I'm breaking up some more of my edges now with some of those brushes designed for breaking up cloud edges, trying to get a little bit more detail in. I felt like overall the piece was a little bit lacking in some of those noisy cloud edge details, which I see so many of in the reference image. And something else worth mentioning is color-wise, I ended up leaning my whole painting a little bit warmer, a little bit peachier, and a little more toward like a red violet gray than a more rather than like a yellowish gray. I think that sort of a gray just feels a little bit more appealing to me, and maybe feels safer to me. Which is worth examining. I think I did lean it a little bit more yellow later on in the process, just slightly. But I think my instinct is often to stray away from yellowish neutrals, just because those can, at least to me, turn into a type of mush that is unappealing very easily. So I think like a more peachy, purpley, neutral gray feels, like I said, like a safer choice to me. So I often make that choice. But, it's also, I think, worth sometimes trying to take those colors that feel more challenging and figuring out how to make them work. And now we're at my favorite stage again, which is where I go and add in paint strokes on top of the more realistic textures that I've built up. And I added quite a bit of paint strokes to this piece. And I think it really benefited from them. Something that I think is worth mentioning about this part of the process for me is that I am usually kind of squinting and blurring my eyes while I'm doing this stage. I'm not always looking at the piece with perfect clarity. And that's another reason why I often zoom out and make it smaller on my canvas. I'm really trying to look at the whole painting as one unit, abstractly even, not necessarily just as individual clouds. but feeling the combination of shapes and the way that the different shapes are playing off of each other. And I'll often just take a moment and sit back and look at it and try to feel if it's balanced, feel if it's appealing in the way that abstract shapes and colors need to be in all of our paintings. You know, we want it to look good representationally, you know, as clouds, but then I also want the piece to feel abstractly balanced and abstractly appealing too. So at this stage, that's often what I'm looking at. And I realized that I wanted it to feel a bit more focused and a bit more detailed, with a higher level of detail in some of these really sharp, harder edged, detailed zones. And you can see that same higher level of detail in the reference image too. So I'm just kind of trying to reinterpret what I see there in my own way, in my own style, but still taking that sort of focal point in that part of the image in the bottom center zone and reinterpret it in a way that suits my sensibilities, but still brings that sharpness and focus and detail to that part of the painting. As I watch this back, I can also see that I changed a lot of the shapes in these clouds too. You know, it's interesting. I really pulled the general idea of the shapes, but then I made some changes to the abstract shapes that we see within the clouds. I think part of that was I wanted to erase out those houses down in the bottom so that this would be just a sky painting. But then also, you know, I actually think that in some ways that shape, the negative space shape that we see in the reference photo, there's something about the way that the part that it stops a bit higher up that is appealing too. You know, it's funny when you look back at your own paintings, you can see some things that maybe you should have done differently or that you would want to try doing differently. But I move through these so quickly and then just move on to the next one that I actually rarely take the chance to sit back and re-examine them later on like this. So it's probably quite beneficial actually to watch them back like this. I think overall this study came out pretty successful for me, given that the colors are quite complicated ones to put next to each other. I did make things a little bit harder on myself. You can see that I added a bit of green into the sky, just because I pulled a gradient of a bit more of a yellow color than I should have right at the beginning. And you can see that in the reference image, the sky is pretty uniformly, you know, powder primary blue back there, but it dips into cyan in a stripe toward the bottom section in my study. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but getting greens in there can make a color palette like this feel harder to get right, just because it's introducing another hue into the painting. But, you know, I think all things considered, I'm quite happy with how this came out. I really like taking more challenging photos sometimes and seeing about making them work. I think it's very fun, and it always pushes me to expand my abilities and add new color combinations to my own painting repertoire. You know, once I figure out, okay, the way that we make this color combination look good is you always have, you know, these three colors next to each other, or you always cocoon this color inside this other color. Put those techniques to use in paintings later on, and I always take those sort of things with me. Alright, and here is the last one in this video. I think this is the weakest one out of the three, so of course I put it at the very back because I know not everyone will make it here, but I think there's still things worth examining in it. I think, you know, in large part, it just ended up not being a study that I was as interested in. I think I don't really love the shape of the cloud in the reference photo. I love the light and I love the luminosity, and the color combination is very, you know, fun and a bit challenging in the way that all gray and orange and blue color combinations can be. But even with those positives, which were why I chose it, I think I still could have chosen a better one, because I have so many photos of clouds that, you know, I think sometimes I go forward with one and then part of the way through I'm not feeling it, but I've already invested too much time, so I may as well finish it. But even despite that, I think I still take something from all of them, and I learn something about myself as an artist and what I like and don't like, and I always take some sort of little thing with me. I think every time I do one of these studies, I think I definitely wasn't as careful in this one. I didn't make my marks as carefully as I should. And that first study you saw, that was actually the third one that I did. And I think part of the reason that I ended up being more careful in that one was because I realized that I was not being careful enough in this one. So, I guess that's something that it taught me as well. I think I also I didn't execute the glow quite right. I leaned it, I think, too peachy, too orangey, too pinky orangey, and not desaturated enough to capture the kind of light that was coming through up top there. And I think that is a tendency of mine that I don't always recognize when it's happening, but it's quite apparent when I look at it later. And I think part of that is that my own work just tends to have so much peachy orange in it that I really tend toward that area on the color wheel. But in this piece, I think it did weaken the image. I think it made the light not appear quite as luminous and lightweight. I don't know if that makes any sense, but as I wanted it to, it feels a little bit heavier than I wanted it to. Something I think I did execute quite well in this one is getting in those really, really thin cloud edges, especially in that upper section there. That's something that I think can be hard to pay enough careful attention to in a quicker study, but just hitting a few of those edges with a really, really thin rim of light, and you can actually even really go sharper and thinner than I did here, but I think that those little edges do a lot of heavy lifting in getting the cloud to look realistic and to feel like it has a form change and to feel like it's really capturing like a more solid, tangible, thick, puffy cloud, but very distant. And you can see what I mean with the light that I painted is just not quite as airy. It's a bit too orange, and I think that if it was a more desaturated, light grayish color, I think the whole piece up there would look a lot airier and a lot brighter. And I think that that is quite lacking in the study that I did. I also just wasn't very interested in being careful with all of those little scattered clouds down at the bottom there. And I think that I did go and refine them a little bit later on. I think I'm doing a little bit of that here. But to get that to feel right, you really need every single one of those little clouds to have a bit of a lighter border. If you're looking at this on a computer screen or a TV screen or something larger, if you look closely, you can see that in the bottom section of the reference image, that type of cloud really, like every single one of those little clouds has a little bit of a highlight, a little bit of a border. And if I just took a little bit of extra time to indicate that, it doesn't need to be indicated 100%, it doesn't need to be rendered 100%, but just to indicate it a little bit more carefully, I think it would have been a more successful painting too. Sorry for roasting this one. I think every once in a while you gotta go in on yourself a little bit. But the other two were quite successful, and there's still things that are successful about this one too. I think the colors in the bottom section turned out quite well, and every time I get more practice with a color combination like this, it becomes a little bit easier to put these sort of colors next to each other in my own paintings. It can always feel a little bit daring to make bold color decisions in the sky, but the more color combinations I have in my mental library from doing studies like this, whether I like them or not, who really cares in the end? It doesn't matter. I'm never going to look at this thing again after I'm done recording the video, or maybe I will someday when I'm cleaning up files on my computer, but that's not the point. The point is to do it and to learn things from it and to take things away from it that I could bring with me into the next time that I paint something like this, particularly if I'm painting something that isn't a study, but that's for something final, something for me, a personal painting, or something for work. Those are the situations where I want to make sure that I'm on my A game and I'm not making any any of the mistakes that I've caught myself making when I'm doing these practice rounds. And that's what makes them so useful. It's like a safer environment to make mistakes and to learn new things. Because in order to get better and in order for more things to be comfortable, we have to paint things that are uncomfortable. That's the only way that we'll ever be able to add them into our comfort zone. And I always want to be adding more stuff to my comfort zone all the time because I love painting all sorts of different things. But then when I'm doing a job, when I'm doing freelance, I need to be pulling usually a little bit more from my comfort zone in order to stay on schedule. But that means that I need to have a big, wide comfort zone. And that is why I love doing exercises like this, because it widens that comfort zone, and it's not a space where it matters if I fail, sometimes failing is more valuable even, I learn more from it, and it's not something that impacts anybody else. It's just me. It's just my little space to experiment. So we're drawing to the end here, and before I let you go, I wanted to ask about your experience doing cloud studies. What are the hard parts and the easy parts for you? What little techniques have you figured out that work well for you, or that help you catch your mistakes? Or what are the tendencies that you find yourself falling into that you like or don't like? I always really am interested to hear that from other artists, because so often I'll be having this conversation with friends, and some of the little eccentricities in their own work that they may not be totally happy with end up being something that I love about their work. It's so interesting how that happens. But I'd love to hear, what have you learned? What has your experience been like? And I will try to hang out in the comments a little bit to talk about painting clouds. This is so, I'm sure it's so in the weeds to someone who is not interested in digital painting, although maybe not. Maybe someone who is not interested in it at all has watched this whole video. In fact, if that's you, I would love to hear what your experience is, but I love to get in the weeds with stuff like this and really just dive super deep into a subject, especially something as beautiful and majestic as clouds and sunsets. I think one of the coolest things about being on planet Earth, and if I can capture even 10% of that beauty in a painting, then that's all in a day's work, right? All right, guys, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.